All right, welcome to TIL Talks with Chris White, where we talk TILs, tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, and all advanced cell therapies, both with patients, caregivers, and industry leaders. Let's get going. Today's guest, I would like to welcome Mrs. Melinda Bachini, a 15-year stage 4 cholangiocarcinoma cancer survivor due to TIL therapy she received out of the NIH. I am more than ecstatic to have her on today. Without further ado, let's get going. So what's up, Melinda? How's it going?
I'm doing good, Chris. How are you?
Cool as a fan. Thank you for coming on TIL Talks. I'm so glad you're here. I got connected with you a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, from a mutual cancer advocate out in Colorado that runs One Cancer Place. It's Erica. So give me a 101 elevator pitch. Who is Melinda?
Yeah, so Melinda Bachini. I'm from Billings, Montana. I'm a wife, mother of 6, grandmother to 4, and I am now a 15-year survivor of stage 4 cholangiocarcinoma, thanks to the TIL therapy.
Beautiful. Tell us a little bit about your diagnosis, your treatment, and then how you got into TIL.
Yeah, so happy to. December 1st, 2009 was the day I got the news. I received a phone call from my gastroenterologist saying, "I'm so sorry, it wasn't on my radar, but you have cancer." And I remember saying, "I'm so sorry, it wasn't on my radar either." And then didn't hear what she said after those 3 words, "You have cancer." Leading up to that, worked as a paramedic for many, many, many years. And I had some right shoulder pain, but I thought it was the packet monitor I carried on my shoulder. I had a lot of fatigue, but I worked 24-hour shifts, and I started to get some GI issues, but we always ate at odd hours of the day and not always healthy. And so everything that I was experiencing, I kind of wrote off to my current job. But fortunately, I happened to be at a critical care nursing course, and we were eating out breakfast and dinner every day, and I really had some really bad upper epigastrial pains and stomach issues. And the doctors there are like, "Oh, it sounds like you have gallstones." And I'm like, "That makes perfect sense. My mom had them too." And I cut out the eggs and cut out the greasy food, and the pain subsided a little bit. But I happened to have already had an appointment with my primary care doc like a week or so after I returned home for something totally different. But I mentioned it to him, and thank goodness he said, "We really need to send you for an ultrasound to check to see if you have gallstones." And it was that ultrasound that found a 13 by 9 centimeter tumor in my liver that I had no idea was there. And that's kind of how the ball got rolling. They didn't know for sure if that was the primary. So I just remember after that ultrasound, I went back for a CT, then an MRI, and then I was literally scanned from head to toe, looking to see if there was a primary somewhere else and it had metastasized to my liver, or if it was a primary tumor in my liver. They were confident that it was probably benign. They were sure it was a hemangioma. That's a benign tumor that females tend to get. And they did a couple tests that proved it wasn't a hemangioma. And ultimately it was a biopsy that I did the day before Thanksgiving, and had to wait all the way through that holiday break to get those results on December 1st.
And that was the biopsy on your liver?
Yes.
Okay. Was it one of those surgically guided biopsies where they have like a scan as they go in and do it, or did they just kind of cut you open and search around till they found it?
No, it was ultrasound guided biopsy with the radiologist there, and they took several cores. And even though the biopsy showed that it was malignant, they weren't sure for sure what the primary cancer was. So I was initially diagnosed with cancer of unknown primary at that time.
Wow, that's intense, because it's the static from the TV's coming, and it's like, "Hey, you got cancer. We don't know the origin of it, but it's in your liver, and now you have to wait for your pathology," correct?
Right. There weren't a lot of options. I knew it was either, primary hepatocellular or intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma, and there was a couple other options in there. So they were saying it was most likely cholangiocarcinoma. But the good news was it was confined to my liver, even though it was a really large tumor. They were able to do surgery. And that was really my first major decision as a patient, was to decide who would I choose for a surgeon. Again, I'm from Billings, Montana. Not a lot of experts here in cholangiocarcinoma. But I was really confident with the surgeons here in Montana, even though we did get a second opinion out at Mayo Clinic. For personal reasons, I chose to stay here and have the surgery done here. One, I was a mother of 6 children and it was Christmas time, and I just did not want to be separated from my kids. That stress was more than the stress of staying here. And two, the surgeons here really won my confidence, and I felt pretty strong that they were able to do what needed to be done. And so 3 weeks after that initial diagnosis, I went in and had 2/3 of my liver resected, and they had clean margins, and we thought things were good until that first post-op scan 3 months later.
Wow. So now you're looking at what, March or so of 2010, is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, it was about that time, and it went back and there were spots on my lungs. And so pretty sure the cancer must have spread before surgery. We just didn't see it, which I'm glad we didn't see it, or they would have canceled the surgery. And I do believe to this day that that surgery bought me the time I needed to find the clinical trial that got me here 15 years later. But yeah, we went back 3 months later, spots in my lungs. I went in for a VATS procedure, video assisted thoracic surgery, where they removed a couple of those spots on my lungs and confirmed that it was metastatic cholangiocarcinoma.
Oh my God, that's intense. Was it like a CT scan they did, or did they do a PET scan to confirm that?
Yes, so they tried to do the CT scan guided biopsy on the lungs to be able to confirm that, but they couldn't get enough tissue. So that's when I went in for the VATS procedure, which was a in-hospital procedure where they go in and with the video assisted and go in and cut out a piece of that tumor and then sent it off to pathology, which involved a chest tube and overnight stay in the hospital, but did confirm that it was metastatic cholangiocarcinoma. And then that just brought on a whole new meaning of, one, it was the first time I ever saw the words. I never asked. I never wanted to know prognosis or details. I could do enough interpreting by reading online. I never wanted to know, how much time I had left. I never asked those kind of things. But I do remember reading one time on like a patient portal, stage 4 terminal cholangiocarcinoma. And I was like, ooh, wow, that's tough. And at 41 years old, mother of 6, I had done enough research to know that if I wanted to find a way to beat this, it had to be something new. The standard of care was only palliative. It wasn't curable. And there was really only one option available for systemic therapy. So I asked my oncologist at the time if he would be proactive and go looking for a clinical trial, which he did, which was amazing. But 15 years ago, my health insurance would not cover the standard of care costs that went into participating in a clinical trial. Yeah. And whole nother rug being pulled out from under your feet. I didn't even know that that was a possibility, which really threw us for a loop. And I didn't want to leave my family in financial distress. So I chose not to do that clinical trial. And we just went along with the palliative care treatment. But in the meantime, that led to my first taste of being a patient advocate. I went with a few patients up to the Capitol in Montana. There was a bill sponsored, and we told our stories. And there was a law passed that said insurance companies did have to cover the standard of care that went into participating in clinical trials in the state of Montana. And that was the first time I think I realized if you share your story, it can really lead to something good. And definitely my first taste of advocacy about, sharing your story and making something good come out of it. But that was a process that took some time. And in the meantime, again, I just had to start that palliative care treatment, knowing that it wasn't curative and that it was probably only going to extend my life by 3 months or so.
Wow. So I just have to ask because I'm still a little bit curious, and I know that anybody listening definitely is. Your diagnosis, that type of carcinoma, how rare is that? Because you're literally, I think, the only person that I've ever come in contact with or have spoken with that type of carcinoma.
Yeah, it's pretty rare. It's a rare form of bile duct cancer, and the type
Okay.
I had originated in the bile ducts inside my liver. So in the US, it's about 2 people to 100,000 people. The statistics say that there's anywhere from 8 to 10,000 cases a year. Unfortunately, it's a pretty dismal diagnosis, and if you were to Google it, it's terrifying.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, we do. I mean, there's been progress made over the last 5 years. We do have new FDA approvals, more targeted therapies, more longer term survivors than ever before. But without getting that initial surgery to remove the tumor, the 5-year survival rate is somewhere around 2%.
That would be classified under a rare disease or an ultra rare disease, correct?
Yes, it's definitely a rare cancer diagnosis. Yes.
We're recording this right now. It's middle of February, but at the end of this month is Rare Disease Week, and the very last day of the month is Rare
Yeah.
Disease Day. So, uh, definitely want to highlight on that.
For sure. And I'm just going to throw out there that February is Cholangiocarcinoma Awareness Month. So we wear a lot of green to bring awareness to it. And February 20th is World Cholangiocarcinoma Day.
That's 2 days from now, correct? Or 3 days from now?
Thursday. Yeah.
Thursday. Okay.
So, yeah, buildings will be lit up across the world in green to try to bring awareness to this rare disease.
Think we wouldn't make enough noise to get the Empire State Building lit up in green?
We're trying, haven't got it yet, but we definitely have a lot of other big buildings that have agreed to light it up.
I'll start one with my downtown is Dallas, Texas, and so we got a little bit of green in our skyline, but also I'm going to start yelling at everybody I know in New York and say somebody's got to know somebody at the Empire State. In fact, I actually met somebody in Philadelphia at the Biotech Alchemy Conference in Philadelphia whose headquarters is there, so doesn't hurt to try.
Not at all. Not at all.
All right. So March 2010, now you have your diagnosis, you're getting into the advocacy, you're starting to learn more about your options.
So
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go
yeah,
ahead.
no. So like I said, I started a double chemo combination. That was the standard of care, gemcitabine and cisplatin. I did that for about 6 months until the toxicity built up, and then they took the cisplatin away, which then my tumor spread from my lungs back to my liver. On the gemcitabine alone. And at that point, they didn't really have much to offer. So they threw another chemo at me, a Taxotere, which I tried for about 6 months with not a lot of success and a lot of side effects. So
For a
that was in
year of chemo.
essence, yeah. I did not handle chemo well. So that was about 18 months, 2 years after my official diagnosis of doing chemos on and off, and with the surgery in the beginning. And it was at that point that I made the decision of quality over quantity, and I stopped all treatments, knowing full well that, I wasn't going to make it, but I wanted whatever time I had left with my family to be quality time. And hardest decision I've ever made in my life, because I did not want my children to think I was giving up or that they weren't worth me suffering through side effects. But fortunately, about 3 weeks after I made that decision, I stumbled upon the clinical trial out at the National Institutes of Health, the National Cancer Institute. And at that time, it was the GI TIL trial. And I sort of stopped looking for clinical trials back then because most of them were chemos in different combinations, and there really wasn't a lot specific for cholangiocarcinoma. So the fact that I stumbled upon this clinical trial was truly miraculous in the first place of how I found it. And then I read it, and I remember reading it. It had the first week of chemo to wipe out your immune system. And in my head, I was like, I can do chemo for a week. Anybody can get through something for a week, right? I can do that. And then after that, it was your immune system doing the work. And then the biggest decision factor for me was the National Cancer Institute is a federally funded facility. And so all the medical costs were covered. My cost to fly from Billings, Montana to Bethesda, Maryland was covered. And that is the only way I would have been able to participate in this trial. And so
Such a blessing.
it was
Such
a
a blessing.
huge, huge blessing. So my husband and I did all the work. We picked up the phone. We called out there. We arranged for our initial consultation. We were accepted into the trial. And so this was about a year later, March of 2012 at that time, or 2 years later after diagnosis, and went out and they removed tumors from my right lung to harvest those T cells, grew them into the billions, went out a month later. Had that first week of chemo to wipe out my immune system. And then I received 42.6 billion cells with the drug called IL-2, which can have some nasty side effects.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third and fourth week in the hospital was recovering my immune system enough to be able to go home. Huge process for sure. Leaving my kids, for 3 to 4 weeks, picking up and traveling across the United States was stressful. But I looked at it like, when I found this trial, I looked at my husband. I'm like, we have absolutely nothing to lose and everything to gain, if it works. And thankfully, it worked. I was the 9th person to enter into the trial, the first with cholangiocarcinoma and the first one to have a response.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
When I entered into the trial, I had tumors all over both my lungs and all over my liver, and I could barely walk 5 steps without going into a coughing fit. My kids couldn't hug me without me starting to cough because there were so many tumors in my lungs. And I remember at the end of that time frame in the hospital, my cough went away. And I was like, "Ooh, something's working here." Yeah. And they were like cautiously optimistic, but I was like, "Oh no, I can feel something's different." And And sure enough, it was. And so for the first 6 months, those tumors were shrinking. It didn't quite hit that 30% response rate, but close. And then it stayed stable for about 6 months, and then they started growing again. But in that 18-month time frame, the research scientists who are studying my T cells discovered that one of my T cells was reactive to one of my mutations in the cancer, and they wanted to retreat me again with these specific T cells. So 18 months after the first T cell TIL therapy, I went in for number 2, which same process. Went in, had more tumors removed from my left lung this time, harvested those T cells, grew them into the lab into the billions, this time 3 times as many T cells, and then with that specific mutation reactive T cell. And then I went back at the October 2013 timeframe for my second TIL therapy. Same process, immunodepleting chemo, receiving 126 billion cells this time. I only ever made it to 4 doses of IL-2 and then recovering my immune system enough to be able to go home. But this time the response rate was even greater, a huge shrinkage, about 50 to 60% overall lungs and liver tumors. Great quality of life. As you know, it's a one-time treatment and great quality of life after that. I just felt so fortunate.
Wow, I got a handful of questions. So when you first came across clinical trial for TIL at the NCI in Maryland, well, you were just doing an internet search. Is that kind of how the thing? You were just looking around and
I was paying a medical bill online, and for some reason, the clinical trials website link was there, and I clicked on it. For some reason, it opened up to the right spot, and it was not intentional by any means.
was it a clinicaltrials.gov or was it
Yes,
specific? Okay.
yes.
Wow, that's incredible. When you first went in there and you did your resection and everything, and you were saying it was about a month for them to grow your cells, were they able to notify you within like a week or so, hey, your cells are growing, we know they're growing, like plan to, come back here within X amount of time frame so you can enter the hospital for lymphodepletion?
Yes, exactly. They definitely let me know cells were growing great in the lab. Everything was looking good. For both TIL treatments, it was about a 4-week process from surgery to receiving the cells.
From resection to infusion. And
Yeah,
then after your infusion, the first time, how many IL-2s? You said you were able to do 6 or
4. I only did 4 each time.
4 each time? Okay.
Yeah, the fluid built up in my lungs and I couldn't take any more.
So when I always talk about IL-2, and I put a video up against this because I get asked this a lot, and I'm sure you do as well, but the side effects that they tell you about, it's like they describe them to you, but they're not your average like side effects. I'm talking about the rigors, the uncontrollable shaking, the shivering, you feel like you're freezing, but you're really running a fever, the unquenchable thirst, and just the intenseness of it. When they described, these are possible, they don't always happen. What were you kind of thinking in terms of like, okay, well, what was going through your head?
That's a great question for my husband because when that happens, that's when I tend to tune out and say, don't want to
Okay.
know these. Because sometimes I feel like when I hear them, I will manifest every one of those side effects. So it's kind of been a partnership with my husband, who he was a nurse at the time. He's a nurse practitioner, but he could handle that, know what to look for, and think on it. But yeah, I always went into it. When I first entered the TIL trial, I remember someone from the team going over the consent form and ending some of the sentences with, and you could die. And I'm like, is she trying to talk me out of this?
Well, if I don't do it, I could also die.
Yeah, well, that was it. And that the fact of the matter was I was going to die anyway. And when you put things into perspective and look at percentages, it's like, okay, it's not much of a bigger risk than the chemo I'm doing with all the side effects it has, right? It's just always a balancing act of what you want to read into it. For me, the IL-2, the biggest issue was the water weight gain overnight, like 20 pounds. And then being exhausted because then you get Lasix and have to go to the bathroom every 20 minutes. And you're
Yep.
so exhausted, you don't want to get up and go, but you have to because
Yeah.
you cannot have a catheter because of the risk of infection.
Yep. I'm not sure if they did this for you, but for me, they are always checking my pH in my urine. And so it's like, you have the jug there, and then you got to hang it up on the side and everything. But yeah, like you just got to go all the time. And it's like, oh, I got to get up again, just get
Yes.
comfortable.
Exactly, exactly. The exhaustion was the biggest part for me. I think the second time through, I remember getting, I was trying to be aware of like you could have hallucinations, right? And so,
Mhm.
first time, nothing. The second time, I swear there was like this funny comedy going on in the back of my head for some reason, and I got like this burst of energy one night, and I was like dancing, and my husband's like, "Okay, what's going on here?"
With all your tubes hanging out with your pole.
Yeah, it was very very comical, but that was short lived.
That was gonna be my next question. With 6 children at home, your husband, was he able to come with you both times as your caregiver to stay with you in the hospital?
Yes, thankfully he was. The NCI has an amazing family lodge right next to the hospital, and he was able to, to have a room there at no charge, and that was incredible. That first night of IL-2 and getting your cells, I remember he stayed in my room just to be there. But other than that, I could kick him out to go get some rest, and very, very beneficial to have him there. I can't imagine doing it without him, but at the same time, very taxing on our kids and our family who had to come help watch them for 3 to 4 weeks each time.
It's a care team, like a multidisciplinary on your medical side, but then on your family, because you still have all of those responsibilities to take care of. They just can't be neglected or anything. It's a constant stress. I don't know if a lot of people really realize. And one thing I definitely want to highlight, and you're now the second person to tell me this, because my last guest, he also did a TIL through the NCI about 10, 12 years ago. But the cost covering, as a patient, I did my clinical trial in Colorado, but it was through a biotherapeutic sponsor, and so I was still responsible for my follow-ups, maintaining insurance and all those on-site, visits for follow-ups and everything, and it adds up. And I'm not sure if the NCI and the NIH still do this. I hope they do, but that's such a wonderful, weight off your shoulders when it's like, okay, the costs that are associated to doing a clinical trial, knowing that those are all taken care of and you don't have to come out of pocket for it. That's, I think, the more people that know that will be directly going to look at the NIH and the NCI and those
Okay.
funded type of trials, because it's that's huge. I'm sitting here thinking, like, I just filed for bankruptcy. So I'm like, wow, what a world of difference. That is incredible.
Again, it made all the difference because I would have never put my family in financial distress for a terminal cancer. And so that's the only reason I was able to participate in this trial is because of that benefit, and huge blessing, huge gift for patients who participate in clinical trials out there. It is so important. And I will say, I didn't know a lot about NIH or the NCI, even though, college classes, you always reference papers from NIH or NCI in different areas, but I had no idea about the clinical trial program, the clinical center, what was offered. And so sometimes I think it's this hidden little secret that we definitely need to be shouting from the mountaintop. And the good news is once I went through that, my oncologist ended up sending more and more patients out there because it opened his eyes to what was available too.
That's it's the whole word of mouth. There's no marketing and advertising in, the clinical world, the biotherapeutics world, the rare disease cancer treatment options. If I'm watching the evening news or primetime TV, you'll see, commercials for approved drugs, on those primetime spots. But you know how expensive that is to do that. And the companies and the organizations that are doing these types of trials, they don't have a marketing budget like that. And also there's all the different rules and laws that go against having to do that. For patients to find out that these even exist, doing exactly what we're doing, we're talking about it, because that word of mouth is more, I think, effective as a testimonial from somebody that's been through it than hearing it from any other source.
Absolutely. And as a patient advocate now, I mean, I do my best to advocate for access to clinical trials everywhere. Every patient should have access to clinical trials. And so always promoting that financial aspect be covered by industry sponsors or academia or, whatever it is, a patient shouldn't have to worry about that.
Yes, until the decentralizing of clinical trials is a thing everywhere. Like you're saying, you're in Montana, and looking at your diagnosis and what doctors, not only in your state, but just in the country you're at and where your options, you're almost forced, you have to travel pretty much if you want to go do something specific like that. And it's a lot, there's so many logistics that go into that. And which brings me to, for myself, and concur if you agree, but getting a diagnosis and going through all that, I believe, was probably worse on my family than I feel it was on me, because for me, I was able to mentally kind of block it out in a certain sense of like, tell me where to go and I'll just show up. But I think what was going through their minds and the emotional aspect of it and the mental health part that's not really spoken or talked about both before, during, and after, and the survivorship part of that. It's huge.
Yeah, no, for sure. I know for me, it's like, give it to me, I can handle it, but don't give it to my family, right? That's when it gets harder. And I just feel like the caregivers, yeah, they have the hardest job because most of the time I know in my case, I felt like my husband felt so helpless, like he wanted to be able to do more and there wasn't, more that he could do. He never felt like he was doing enough.
Sometimes just being there and just having someone within your presence, I feel that goes like an extremely long way. I pretty quickly moved in or put all my stuff in storage, broke the lease in my apartment. I moved in with my mother, and I still say to this day, like, the time that I was going through all the treatments and everything was some of the best times of my life, because I was surrounded around family again, and I had somebody there all the time. And to think if something were to happen to me and nobody was around, then what? I mean, I would, to have those visions of, being found or something like that. Uh, the After going through treatment, it's like, go back to normal. And for myself, it was, in the beginning of 2020. And so it's like, I'm, going back to normal about being alone, and COVID was in its height and everything. And it was like, that wasn't a positive thing for me necessarily, to go back to normal with being alone and
Yeah.
not being able to be surrounded by people and that support system. So
It's a whole new normal for sure. I don't think we've ever gone back to pre-cancer days. It's a whole new normal, whole new career for me, whole new way of life, not just for me, but for my kids and for my husband. I mean, I think about every one of my kids. There's not one child who didn't write about this cancer diagnosis or the treatment or this rare disease as a high school paper or a college paper. They learned and took so much from it as well. And as much as I would never wish this diagnosis on anyone, right now I would have a hard time taking it back, obviously, because I had such a good response to the TIL therapy. And two, it's easy for me to look back now and see all the good that came from it. But it's not always that way. And the outcomes can always be so much more difficult and harder. But the thing is you get a cancer diagnosis and life goes on. Other bad things still happen. It doesn't stop just because you get a cancer diagnosis. You still have to deal with life, period.
yeah, there's no crystal ball that's going to tell you what's going to happen and how to deal with it. You're just, you're winging it as you go. And, if we all had a time machine and could do it all over again, I wouldn't probably change anything, because it's defined who I am. I mean, I tell people I feel I was like almost this kind of wandering soul, in my employment and the career that I was in. I wasn't doing it because I was like, this is what I've always wanted to do, and I'm just totally in love with it. It's one of those things where you got to pay the bills and you got to keep a roof over your head. And I had symptoms for almost 6 months before I went to go get checked, because in the career I was in, like, the more you step away from it, the more you have to catch up on it. And it was one of those things to where afterwards I went back to work, and within like 2 years, I realized, I'm like, I should not be spinning my wheels and spending the time on this life when it's not something I'm really wanting to do. Anything can happen at any time. When you hear the saying, that, live your life to the fullest, or, live every day like your last, like, that's what I was going to do. And I, it changes someone. There's no it's a whole another life and an existence.
Agreed.
It's insane.
Agreed, 100% agreed. And I did love my job. I loved what I did. I loved everything about it. I wanted to hang on to it for as long as I possibly could, and I just couldn't anymore with treatment. But I had to go on disability for 5+ years after being diagnosed, and that was rough too. Rough on us as a family, income, insurance wise, mentally. You do lose your identity because always thought of myself as being a paramedic kind of thing. But then again, yeah, you have to cherish every day, and it's the new normal. And I love my job now because I get to help people. But I always say it's way more stressful than it was being a paramedic, because now I feel like I can't do enough fast enough to help cancer patients, and you want to be able to help them. The urgency is so prevalent, and it's there all the time. And I just feel like you can't go fast enough.
Yeah, there's a new weight on the shoulders, and it doesn't come off. In fact, it almost feels like it gets heavier over
Yeah.
time. Well, I wanted to go back, and so after you went through and did the second round of doing your TILs, you had the specific targeted mutation. How long of a follow-up protocol was that for doing scans? I remember you saying that your first set of scans afterwards was what, like 50 to 60% reduction, and then it continued to
Yeah.
decrease.
So
How long of a time frame?
that first year following both treatments, I went back monthly for scans and follow up. And then it decreased to like every 3 to 4 months, the second year. 3 years after my second TIL treatment, the cancer started growing again. And so we watched it proactively for a little while. And then Dr. Rosenberg decided to be proactive, and he went in and removed the remaining tumors on my right lung and researched them, resequenced them, and they found out those mutation reactive T cells were still present, which was good. That same mutation was still in my tumor tissue, but this time the cancer was throwing off that PD-L1 protein to block my immune system from recognizing it, and they chose to give me pembrolizumab, the Keytruda drug. And I remember after the second dose, it opened that window enough for the T cells to recognize the cancer again. And again, another big drastic shrinkage. And they only gave me a total of 8 doses. And that was the last treatment I've had. In March, it'll be 8 years since I've had any treatment. So then after that, it was, then scans went to every 6 months, and then it went to yearly. And now I've pretty much phased out of the clinical trial, which I can tell you was a little horrifying for me, right? You become so dependent on this clinical trial team after being involved in 10 years, 10,
That's
12
your
years.
normal.
It was a little terrifying when they cut the cord, and I have to come back to figuring out how to get plugged into my local oncologist, how to do surveillance here. And it was definitely stressful. But now I just push for yearly scans, yearly blood work to keep up on it, because this cancer does have a high recurrence rate, and I just don't ever want to be caught off guard.
I look up to you for that because I finished my 60-month consent in this last August, and my day zero was January 15th of 2020, and they said 60 months up to 5 years of follow-ups, and I'm sitting here thinking, okay, 5 years would be January of 2025, and I didn't know that the months they were talking about are 28-day months. And so my initial follow-ups were, I think, 3 scans after day zero that were 6 weeks apart. And my first set of scans was 50 to 60% reduction, and then it continued to decrease. And by 9 months, they were saying, hey, we think you have a complete metabolic response. And I was just doing CTs, so they wanted to do a PET scan a month later to confirm if there was any uptake or not. And at that point, there was just this one little spot, starting to feel like, okay, but I wasn't like, thrown any parties or anything yet, because it was like, okay, well, there's this fading little spot in my thoracic inlet. And then, continue to do my 3-month scans. But by January of 2021, which was exactly 1 year from doing my infusion, I did one more follow-up PET, which was 3 months later, and that spot in the thoracic inlet was gone. And so at that point, it was like, okay, there's zero uptake. What's showing up on CTs is either calcified or necrotic, and even those little spots are still shrinking. But the protocol is still go in on site every 3 months. Within this, you have I had a window of plus or minus 7 days from whatever date it needed to be. And I had to be on site and do labs and scans. But since COVID hit, I was allowed to do telehealth here in Texas and then, send the disc and go over the results via telehealth. But in 2022, when those restrictions let up, it was go back on site. And so once I finished my 60-month consent this last August, I went one more time in November of last year because I'd already hit all my deductibles and na. But now I'm going from scanning from a minimum of at least 4 times a year, which was quarterly. And then if there was anything in between that was a concern, I would go like every 6 weeks. But I did nearly 100 scans within like 5 or 6 years, talking brain MRIs, CTs, and all that. And now the protocol for the time being is just me and my oncologist, CTs every 6 months. And it's been hard for me to adjust mentally from going of a normal of being monitored very extremely closely to like, well, like whatever you want to do, 6 months. And it's like, couldn't we, adjust it to every 3 times a year for a year or two and then go down to twice a year? Can we kind of, like
Ease
taper,
into it. Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like that's, it sucks. And I won't do another CT until May next week. Or this week, I got to go in and do another brain MRI because they were following some scar tissue. So that it appeared, but it's scar tissue. So I'm still doing every 3 month brain MRIs, but that was my normal for so long, being sick and getting constant labs and follow-ups and all that. And the adjustment of like, okay, like, it's been tough. It's been real tough. I've really talked to a lot of people about it, but it sucks.
Yes, it is tough. Like I just went in just this week actually to a new oncologist, and and I have to explain your history, your story, everything about it. It's starting all over where, for 10, 12 years, everyone knew everything. And it was so comforting. And it does feel like starting all over. And everyone's like, well, you're in remission. You should be fine. I'm like, first of all, it's hard for me to believe in remission with this cancer, period. And yeah, knock on wood, I feel like everything's going to be great moving forward, but I'm also going to be proactive to make sure we're on top of it if it doesn't. And that's the hard part, is convincing someone who hasn't been in the game with you for the last 10 years of being on your team and how it's going to move forward. But every day I tell patients how to advocate for themselves. And now I'm learning how to do it all over again for myself.
All right, in consideration of time, this will conclude the first part of the conversation with my guest, but no worries. We are picking up right where we left off with continuing talking TILs on TIL Talks and all advanced cell and gene therapies in part 2. So stay tuned. It's coming.